If you love stories about power, justice, and people getting exactly what they deserve, make sure you like this video and subscribe before we start. You won't want to miss what happens next. The boardroom was dead silent. 23 people sat around a long mahogany table: investors, executives, legal counsel, and board members, all watching as Marcus Hale, CEO of Vertex Dynamics, rose from his chair with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who believed he owned every room he walked into. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and pointed one manicured finger at the woman seated at the far end of the table. "Dr. Simone Carter," he said, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade, "your services are no longer required. Security will escort you out. No warning, no prior conversation, no closed-door meeting, just a public execution performed in front of every person in that building who mattered." Simone didn't flinch, she didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice or knock over her chair. She simply looked at Marcus Hale with a calm, steady gaze that made a few of the board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Then she reached for her notebook, capped her pen, and stood up with the kind of quiet dignity that people spend their whole lives trying to manufacture but rarely actually have. "Understood," she said softly. As she walked out of that room, the sound of her heels against the hardwood floor echoed down the hallway. Marcus smiled, satisfied. The room exhaled. Nobody, not one single person at that table, had any idea that the woman who just walked out the door was the only reason Vertex Dynamics still existed. Vertex Dynamics had been founded 12 years earlier as a mid-sized tech firm specializing in secure data compression software for enterprise clients. For the first 6 years, the company was unremarkable: decent revenue, modest growth, and a rotating cast of executives who made big promises and delivered average results. The kind of company that exists in every city, fills a floor or two of a glass office building, and is forgotten the moment someone stops working there. That changed the year Simone Carter joined the engineering team. Simone had grown up in Baltimore, the daughter of a mechanic and a school librarian. She'd been the kind of child who took apart radios just to understand how they worked and who read technical manuals the way other kids read comic books. She'd earned a scholarship to MIT at 17, completed her undergraduate degree in computer science in 3 years, and gone straight into a doctoral program focused on data encryption and compression algorithms. By the time she was 28, she had published 4 peer-reviewed papers, presented at 2 international conferences, and turned down job offers from companies that most people would have given their left hand to work for. She chose Vertex Dynamics because of a single line in their job posting: "We are building something that has never been built before." It was probably marketing language. It was almost certainly written by someone in HR who had no idea what the engineers actually did. But Simone believed it, or at least she wanted to, and so she took the job. Within 8 months, she had redesigned the core architecture of Vertex's flagship product, a compression software that handled encrypted data transfers for financial institutions. The redesign was not incremental. It was not a patch or an update. It was a fundamental reimagining of how the software worked at the algorithmic level, cutting processing time by 62% and improving compression ratios in ways that none of the senior engineers had thought possible. The clients noticed immediately. 3 Fortune 500 banks, which had been politely fielding competitor offers for months, renewed their contracts without negotiation. A pharmaceutical company that had been evaluating other options signed a 5-year deal. Revenue increased by 38% in the following fiscal year. Simone did not take credit loudly. She didn't send company-wide emails or request a corner office. She filed for a patent, U.S. Patent 11,204,887, on the underlying algorithm she had developed, with Vertex Dynamics listed as her employer of record. Standard procedure as far as she understood it. The legal team had handled the paperwork. Nobody had explained to her, and she had not thought to ask, about the specific language of the employment agreement she had signed. That agreement, buried in Section 14, Subsection C, Paragraph 3, stated that any intellectual property developed by an employee using company resources would be jointly owned by the employee and the company, with the employee retaining a 51% controlling interest if the development had occurred outside of officially assigned project scope. Simone had built the algorithm on her personal laptop over 3 consecutive weekends because she'd been working through a problem she found intellectually interesting. She had not been assigned to redesign the architecture. She had simply done it because she couldn't stop thinking about it. The patent, as a result, belonged to Simone Carter, not 50-50, not to Vertex Dynamics, to Simone. Nobody at Vertex had noticed. Marcus Hale became CEO in Simone's 4th year at the company. He arrived from a background in sales and finance, recruited by the board after the previous CEO retired. He wore his suits like armor and spoke in the language of quarterly projections and shareholder value, with the fluency of someone who had never once in his life written a single line of code. He believed with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything important that technology was a resource, like oil or timber, and that the people who managed resources were more important than the people who produced them. He and Simon were never going to get along. This much was obvious from their first meeting, when he mispronounced algorithm twice in a presentation, and then, when she gently corrected him, smiled and said, "We have people for the technical details." She was, to him, a detail. A line item on a budget, a name on an org chart. Over the next 2 years, the friction grew. Simon flagged concerns about a new product line Marcus was pushing, a consumer-facing app that he believed would democratize Vertex's technology and open new revenue streams. She ran the numbers, reviewed the market data, and presented a 12-page analysis explaining why the product would cannibalize their enterprise client base without meaningfully expanding their market share. She was professional, thorough, and completely correct. Marcus thanked her for her input and moved forward anyway. The app launched. It underperformed. The enterprise clients, exactly as Simon had predicted, began asking questions about data security and brand positioning. 2 of them paused contract renewals pending strategic review. The board, which had approved the app enthusiastically 18 months earlier, began looking for someone to blame. Marcus, who had spent 2 decades in corporate environments and understood how blame worked, began quietly repositioning the narrative. In conversations with board members, in offhand comments at executive dinners, in the subtle grammar of internal memos, he suggested that the engineering team had failed to execute properly on his vision, that there had been communication issues and missed milestones, that certain members of the team had been resistant to innovation. Simon's name came up in these conversations with increasing frequency. She was not aware of any of this. She was, as she almost always was, working. The annual board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday in March. Simon had been invited to present an updated technical roadmap, a routine presentation she had given 3 times before. She prepared for 2 weeks, building a comprehensive deck that addressed the client concerns, proposed a recalibration of the product strategy, and outlined an 18-month plan to stabilize and grow the enterprise side of the business. She arrived early, set up her laptop, and arranged her notes. The board members filed in. The investors took their seats. Marcus Hale sat at the head of the table with the comfortable authority of someone who already knows how the meeting is going to go. He waited until the room was fully settled. Then he waited a little longer, letting the silence do its work. And then, before Simon could open her presentation, before anyone could speak, he stood up and said her name. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, and the ripples moved through the room in different ways. Some board members looked confused. One investor, a woman named Patricia Voss, who had been with the company since its founding, frowned deeply and leaned forward. A few of the executives kept their faces carefully neutral, the practiced blankness of people who had seen this kind of thing before and had learned not to react until they knew which way it was going to fall. Marcus outlined his reasoning in the smooth, rehearsed cadence of someone who had practiced this speech: performance issues, cultural misalignment, a need to take the engineering vision in a new direction. He used the word restructuring twice. He did not use the word termination, but everyone in the room understood that the two meant the same thing in this context. When he finished, he gestured toward the door with an open hand, like he was a host inviting a guest to leave a party. Simone sat still for a moment that stretched just slightly too long. Then she stood up, and instead of walking to the door, she opened her laptop. "Before I go," she said, in a voice that was quiet and even and absolutely clear, "there's something the board should know." Marcus started to speak. Patricia Voss raised her hand and silenced him with the authority of someone who had been in this industry before he was a management consultant. "Let her speak," she said. Simone pulled up a document. On the screen behind her, the presentation screen she had set up that morning, a PDF appeared. It was the patent filing. U.S. Patent 11,204,887. Her name was on the cover page, large and unambiguous. The algorithm that powers Vertex's core product, the technology that generates approximately 74% of this company's annual revenue, is built on this patent, she said. "And this patent belongs to me." The room went very, very quiet. She walked them through it, methodically, without drama, without any of the emotional performance that Marcus had perhaps expected or hoped for. She explained when the algorithm had been developed, the circumstances under which it had been created, and the specific language of the employment agreement that governed intellectual property ownership. She referenced Section 14, subsection C, paragraph 3, and quoted the relevant clause from memory. She then pulled up a second document, a legal opinion she had quietly commissioned 6 months earlier from a firm that specialized in technology IP law, when she had first begun to sense that her position at the company was being undermined. The opinion was 6 pages long and concluded, in unambiguous language, that Simone Carter retained controlling ownership of the patent in question. A board member near the middle of the table, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had made his money in enterprise software acquisitions, leaned toward the general counsel and whispered something. The general counsel's face had gone the color of old paper. "What this means," Simone continued, still calm, still measured, "is that if I leave this company today, voluntarily or otherwise, the license agreement that allows Vertex Dynamics to use this technology becomes subject to the termination and renegotiation clauses in the patent agreement, a copy of which I have already provided to my attorney." She paused. "I'm not trying to threaten anyone," she said. "I just think the board deserves to have complete information before it makes decisions." Marcus Hale had not sat back down. He was still standing at the head of the table, and he looked, for the first time in perhaps a decade, like a man who had no idea what to do next. The confidence that had been so thick around him minutes ago had evaporated. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Patricia Voss cut through the silence before he could find his footing. "Marcus," she said, "I'd like you to step out while the board convenes." It was not a suggestion. He left. What followed over the next several weeks was not a single dramatic moment, but a series of smaller ones, each more consequential than the last. The board convened an emergency session the following morning. They brought in outside legal counsel, a different firm from the one Vertex had previously used, to conduct an independent review of the patent situation. That review took 11 days and concluded exactly what Simone's legal opinion had concluded. The patent was hers, the license was contingent on her continued relationship with the company, and the terms of that license had never been formally negotiated because no one had ever thought to look at them. The general counsel resigned at the end of the second week. He cited personal reasons in his letter, which everyone understood to mean that he had failed to identify a patent ownership issue so fundamental that it had been sitting in the company's legal filings for years, completely unexamined. Marcus Hale lasted 3 weeks after the board meeting. His exit was announced in a press release that described it as a mutual decision and thanked him for his contributions to Vertex's growth. His actual departure was reportedly neither mutual nor gracious, and a source close to the board, later quoted in an industry newsletter, described the final conversation between Marcus and the board chair as brief. Simone was asked, formally and in writing, to remain at Vertex Dynamics. The letter came from Patricia Voss personally, and it was accompanied by a proposed renegotiation of her employment agreement, a significant revision to her compensation structure, and an offer of a newly created position, Chief Technology Officer. The patent license was formalized into a new agreement that properly reflected Simone's ownership stake and included provisions for revenue sharing, credit attribution, and governance rights that gave her meaningful input into how the core technology was developed and licensed going forward. She took a week to think about it. In that week, she had 3 conversations with other companies, including 2 of the firms she had turned down years earlier when she chose Vertex. She received offers, good ones. But she thought about the original job posting that had caught her attention all those years ago, the one that promised something that had never been built before. She thought about the engineers on her team, several of whom had sent her personal messages after the board meeting, expressing things they had clearly been waiting a long time to say. She thought about what it might mean to stay somewhere, not because she had to, but because she had actually won. She accepted the offer. In her first week as CTO, she restructured the engineering leadership to eliminate 2 layers of middle management that had been functioning primarily as obstacles between the technical team and the executive suite. She formalized a policy requiring that all patent filings be reviewed by an IP attorney before submission, and that employment agreement terms around intellectual property be clearly explained to every new hire. She launched the 18-month technical roadmap that she had prepared for the board meeting that Marcus Hale had tried to turn into her firing. The 2 clients who had paused their contract renewals came back within a quarter, both signing extensions that were larger than their previous agreements. Marcus Hale surfaced about 8 months later as a VP of strategy at a mid-sized logistics firm in another city. His LinkedIn profile did not mention Vertex Dynamics by name, listing the position only as technology company, enterprise software sector. People in the industry noticed. Nobody said anything publicly, which is its own kind of consequence. Simone gave an interview to a technology publication about 18 months after the board meeting. The journalist asked her what had been going through her mind in those seconds between when Marcus fired her and when she decided to open her laptop. She thought about it for a moment. "I wasn't angry," she said finally. "I was disappointed. Not just in him, in myself, a little, for not having that conversation sooner, for letting things get to a point where someone could stand up in front of a room and treat me like I was disposable." She paused. "But then I remembered something my father used to say. He was a mechanic. He'd say, when a job goes wrong, the first thing you do is stop and look at what's actually in front of you. Don't panic, don't walk away, just look." She smiled. So I looked. The article ran under the headline, "The Engineer Who Wouldn't Leave." It was a good headline, but it missed the real story, which was not about staying or leaving. It was about what happens when someone spends years building something real in a world that keeps trying to convince them that they don't matter, and then, in a single quiet moment, decides to show everyone exactly what they were holding. Some rooms underestimate people on purpose. Some rooms do it by accident. The outcome, when the truth comes out, tends to be the same. Vertex Dynamics went on to have its best revenue year in company history the year after Simone became CTO. She kept her name on the patent. She kept the patent agreement active and fair. She kept her pen capped and her notebook close. And she never again walked into a boardroom without knowing, very precisely, everything she was carrying with her. If you made it to the end of this story, then you already know why you need to like this video and subscribe. Stories like this one, about real power, quiet courage, and justice that actually arrives, are what this channel is built on. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. It only gets better from here.